Listen carefully, because this is where most people misunderstand the quiet ones, the ones who feel deeply, the ones who gave without keeping score. When a narcissist hurts a good empath, it doesn't explode outward at first. It collapses inward. There's no immediate retaliation, no loud confrontation, no dramatic exit. Instead, there's silence. And that silence, it's not weakness, it's processing. It's observation. It's the mind trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. Because the empath gave you something rare, pure intention, no hidden agenda, no manipulation, just presence, just loyalty. And when that gets betrayed, it doesn't just hurt their feelings, it fractures their reality. They start questioning everything, not just you, but themselves. Was I too much? Did I misread everything? Was any of it real? That's the first stage. Confusion. But here's where it shifts, and most people miss it, because while the narcissist is busy moving on, finding new supply, telling new stories, the empath is evolving quietly, dangerously. They start connecting patterns. They replay conversations not emotionally, but analytically. They begin to see the manipulation, the inconsistencies, the subtle control tactics they ignored before. And once that awareness clicks, there's no going back. Now you're not dealing with the same person anymore. You're dealing with someone who is seen behind the mask. And once an empath sees the truth, they don't argue about it. They detach from it completely. No closure conversation, no revenge, no announcement, just distance. And that distance, it's not temporary, it's permanent. Because the empath doesn't just leave physically, they withdraw emotionally, psychologically, energetically. You can still reach their phone, but you'll never reach their heart again. And that's the part that hits the narcissist the hardest, because what they lost wasn't just a person, they lost someone who believed in them, someone who saw potential even when it wasn't deserved, someone who stayed longer than anyone else would have. But here's the truth, most people don't want to accept you don't get unlimited access to a good empath. You get chances. And every time you cross a line, something inside them closes, quietly, until one day, there's nothing left to access. And when that day comes, there's no fixing it. No apology that works. No memory strong enough to pull them back. Because once an empath learns the lesson, they don't repeat the experience. They upgrade their standards. They sharpen their boundaries. And they walk forward stronger, colder, clearer. So if you've been hurt like this, understand something you didn't lose. You woke up, and that awakening, that's where your power begins. When a deeply empathetic person invests emotional energy into someone who consistently undermines or manipulates them, the impact goes far beyond temporary hurt. It disrupts their internal sense of identity and emotional stability in a profound way. Empaths naturally process the world through connection, intuition, and emotional attunement, which means they often absorb not just words but underlying intentions, tones, and inconsistencies. When faced with behavior that contradicts what they feel versus what they are told, they may feel confused, frustrated, or even angry. Their mind enters a state of cognitive dissonance where two conflicting realities compete for validation. Instead of immediately rejecting the harmful behavior, the empath tends to self-reflect, first questioning their own perceptions, intentions, and even worth, which can delay protective action. This prolonged internal conflict gradually drains their emotional resources, leading to mental fatigue and a quiet withdrawal from the dynamic. What appears externally as silence or passivity is actually a complex neurological defense mechanism activating to preserve what remains of their psychological safety. During this phase, the empath begins to observe patterns more objectively, connecting past experiences with present behavior and recognizing subtle forms of manipulation that were previously overlooked due to emotional attachment. As clarity increases, something shifts internally. The emotional bond weakens while awareness strengthens. This transformation is not sudden but accumulative, built on repeated instances of unmet emotional needs and broken trust. Eventually, the empath reaches a threshold where continuing the relationship becomes psychologically unsustainable, and at that point, detachment occurs not out of anger but out of necessity. This detachment is often final because it is rooted in understanding rather than impulse. And once the empath fully comprehends the nature of the dynamic, their capacity to re-engage in the same way no longer exists, leading to the establishment of firm, often irreversible boundaries that prioritize long-term emotional well-being over temporary connection. When a psychologically manipulative personality consistently targets a deeply empathetic individual, the second stage of the experience often shifts from emotional confusion into analytical awareness. At this point, the empath is no longer reacting purely from feeling but begins to process events through pattern recognition. The mind starts replaying conversations not with emotional intensity, but with increasing detachment, almost as if reviewing evidence. Subtle inconsistencies that were once dismissed as misunderstandings now appear as deliberate behaviors. This transition is critical because it marks the beginning of internal reorganization where emotional attachment is slowly replaced by clarity. The empath begins to understand that the discomfort they felt was not random, but the result of repeated boundary violations and emotional invalidation. This realization does not arrive as a single moment of awakening but accumulates gradually through repeated exposure to contradiction between words and actions. As this awareness deepens, emotional dependency weakens and a protective cognitive shift occurs, where the mind prioritizes self-preservation over connection. This is also where emotional energy begins to retract inward, not as avoidance but as recalibration. The empath becomes quieter, more observant, and significantly less reactive, which often confuses the other party who was accustomed to emotional responsiveness. However, internally, a major restructuring is taking place where the empath is rebuilding their internal standards of trust and recalibrating what is acceptable in human connection. As this process continues, the empath reaches a stage of psychological independence where emotional investment is no longer automatic. They start distinguishing between genuine connection and emotional manipulation with far greater precision. This is not driven by resentment, but by heightened emotional intelligence shaped through experience. The brain effectively learns from emotional injury, reinforcing neural pathways that prioritize caution, observation, and delayed trust. Once this state stabilizes, the empath no longer engages from a place of hope that the other person will change, but from a clear understanding of behavioral patterns. This clarity leads to emotional detachment that is not dramatic but decisive. They do not announce their withdrawal or seek validation for their decision. Instead, they simply reduce access, interaction, and emotional availability. Over time, this creates a permanent shift in relational behavior where past tolerance levels are no longer accessible. What once felt like love mixed with confusion transforms into a structured boundary system designed to prevent repetition of emotional harm, ensuring that future connections are evaluated through consistency, respect, and psychological safety rather than emotional intensity alone. When a deeply empathetic person reaches the later stage of emotional detachment, after being repeatedly hurt in a manipulative dynamic, something significant shifts in their inner world. The emotional system that once responded quickly, trusted deeply, and forgave easily begins to reorganize itself into a more structured and self-protective state. This is not emotional coldness, but emotional recalibration. The empath starts prioritizing consistency over intensity, actions over promises, and patterns over isolated moments of affection. Their nervous system, after prolonged exposure to inconsistency and emotional unpredictability, begins to seek stability above all else. As a result, their tolerance for confusion, mixed signals, and psychological discomfort dramatically decreases. What once might have been excused as misunderstanding is now recognized as a behavioral pattern. This shift is subtle but powerful because it fundamentally changes how they engage with relationships moving forward. Instead of reacting with hope or emotional repair attempts, they begin to respond with observation and evaluation. Their energy becomes more contained, directed inward rather than outward, allowing them to rebuild emotional equilibrium that was previously disrupted. This stage often appears calm on the surface, but internally it is a restructuring of identity, where self-worth is no longer negotiated through external validation but anchored in internal standards of respect and emotional safety. As this transformation deepens, the empath develops a heightened ability to detect emotional manipulation early. Their awareness is no longer reactive but preventative. They no longer need to experience prolonged harm to recognize unhealthy dynamics. Instead, they identify subtle cues much earlier in the interaction. This is because the brain has effectively learned from previous emotional patterns and encoded them into instinctive caution. At this stage, emotional investment is no longer automatic but selective. The empath does not close themselves off from connection, but they filter it through a more refined internal system that evaluates consistency, accountability, and emotional reciprocity. This creates a natural boundary that does not require confrontation to enforce. People who rely on emotional control or inconsistency often find themselves unintentionally excluded because they fail to meet the new psychological criteria established by experience. Eventually, this leads to a permanent transformation in how the empath engages with relationships. They no longer seek intensity as a sign, connection, but stability as proof of safety. Their emotional world becomes less about reaction and more about discernment. This does not make them distant in a negative sense, but rather precise in their emotional choices. They invest less frequently, but more intentionally. ensuring that their energy is directed toward environments and people who demonstrate genuine respect and emotional clarity. Over time, this creates a lasting internal shift where past patterns are no longer revisited, not because of resentment, but because the lesson has already been integrated into their emotional framework, making repetition unnecessary and self-protection instinctive. After repeated emotional exposure to inconsistency, manipulation, or psychological invalidation, the final stage in an empath's transformation is not emotional collapse but emotional sovereignty. At this point, the internal system that once prioritized understanding others begins to prioritize self-protection with precision. The empath no longer operates from confusion or hope, but from clear psychological awareness shaped by lived experience. Emotional memory plays a key role here, as the brain retains patterns of harm and automatically flags similar dynamics in the future. This creates an internal filter that activates before deep emotional attachment can form, reducing vulnerability to repetition of past wounds. What once felt like deep emotional connection is now carefully evaluated for stability, accountability, and mutual respect. The shift is not driven by bitterness, but by learned clarity. The nervous system, after prolonged exposure to emotional stress, naturally seeks environments that feel predictable and safe rather than intense and uncertain. This is why the empath begins to disengage earlier from dynamics that show signs of imbalance, even if those signs are subtle or socially normalized. As this protective awareness strengthens, emotional reactivity significantly decreases. Canes that once triggered confusion, overthinking, or emotional urgency now produce observation instead of reaction. The empath begins to pause internally before responding, allowing logic and pattern recognition to override impulse. This creates a noticeable behavioral shift. They speak less, observe more, and reveal less emotional access. This is often misinterpreted by others as detachment or distance, but internally it is simply control being restored. The empath is no longer emotionally available to dynamics that do not demonstrate consistency over time. This stage is crucial because it represents the transition from emotional participation to emotional discernment, where engagement is no longer automatic but conditional on behavioral evidence. Eventually, this leads to a restructuring of relational standards. The empath no longer evaluates people based on potential or emotional intensity, but on repeated actions and behavioral alignment. Trust becomes something earned gradually rather than given freely. This does not reduce their capacity to love, but it refines how and where that love is directed. Emotional energy becomes a resource, not an obligation, and is allocated only where psychological safety is consistently demonstrated. This results in fewer but healthier connections where depth is no longer confused with instability. Over time, the empath develops a strong internal boundary system that operates without effort, guiding decisions instinctively and preventing re-entry into harmful cycles. In the final layer of this transformation, there is a quiet but profound shift in identity. The empath no longer defines themselves through how much they endure or how deeply they feel, but through how wisely they choose. Emotional awareness becomes integrated into their core behavior, not as a reaction to pain, but as a permanent framework for living. This creates a stable inner state where past experiences are no longer emotional triggers but reference points for discernment. The result is not emotional shutdown, but emotional precision, where every connection is measured not by intensity, but by truth, consistency, and respect.